Afternoon, everybody. My name is Will Pomerantz. I'm the director of the Kennan Institute, and we are so pleased to have Michael Kimmage here today to talk about his new book, and I have a copy right here, Collisions, and there are copies outside the hall as well. Just a brief few notes just before we begin. I encourage you everyone to stay in touch with the Kennan Institute, with our Focused Ukraine and Russian File blogs. For those of you who, for our virtual audience, if you have questions for our speaker, please submit them via email to kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter @Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page. At any time, please include your name and affiliation when sending questions. I will begin by introducing our speaker. Dr. Michael Kimmage is chair of the Kennan Institute Advisory Council, as well as professor of history at Catholic University. He specializes in the history of the Cold War in the 20th century, in U.S. diplomatic history and intellectual history as well, and the state of U.S.-Russian relations. From 2014 to 2016, he served on the Secretary's Policy Planning Staff at the U.S. State Department, where he held the Russia-Ukraine profile. Michael, floor is yours.
Thank you so much for the kind introduction, Will, and thanks so much to the Kennan Institute for the invitation to speak about my book this afternoon. I've been doing many book presentations in the last couple of months, and in the language of sports, they all feel a little bit like away games, and this feels like a home game, so it's, I guess, home turf advantage. I'm not sure who I'm playing against, but that's the sentiment. Maybe I'll just introduce the book very briefly, because I know that, Will, you have questions, and I'm sure our audience will have questions as well. All I wish to explain by way of introduction is the title of the book, and the rather precise question of why it's a noun in the plural, collisions, rather than in the singular. The story of a war might presumably be a collision, but the key framing for my book is that the war in Ukraine, whether we understand it from 2014 to the present or 2022 to the present, is not a singular war or a singular conflict, but it goes across three separate axes. So I'll just describe those very briefly and then make a concluding generalization about these three axes of tension or of conflict, and we'll very much look forward to your questions after that. Will. The first and obvious axis of conflict is Russia-Ukraine. These are the two relevant armies that are in the midst of a major war, Europe's most significant war since 1945. And I think it is possible to infer from the war at its present stages that new nations, new countries will emerge from it, two new countries, a new Ukraine and a new Russia. That's to say that the war is so significant in the lives of these two countries that it will transform them in some profound way. What the nature of that transformation is difficult to guess at the moment, but I'm comfortable in making the prediction that this war will be, along this particular axis, transformative. Secondly, and I think it's obvious, but maybe slightly less so than the Russia-Ukraine axis of tension or of conflict, is the Russia-Europe axis of tension and of conflict. Here, one could tick through a couple of significant points that the narrative could well begin. There are many decisions that you can make when you decide when to begin the narrative. I chose 2008, but you could also choose 2009 as the beginning point of the narrative of the current war, because that's the year that the European Union came up with the Eastern Partnership Program addressed toward Ukraine, Belarus, Moldova, Azerbaijan, Armenia, Georgia, and that, which seemed rather unspectacular at the time, almost like a bureaucratic procedure, generated something called the Association Agreement, which it became the decision of the then president of Ukraine, Viktor Yanukovych, to sign or not to sign, which could seem like a small decision, but over time it became a large decision, as if you were deciding between the two fates for Ukraine, between Russia and Europe, and he chose not Europe, but Russia, and that, I think, as we all know, sparked a revolution in Ukraine, the Maidan Revolution, Revolution of Dignity, the Euromaidan, and that, in turn, when Viktor Yanukovych flees to Russia in the third week of February 2014, is followed by the annexation of Crimea and incursion of Russian military forces into eastern Ukraine or the Donbass. Europe has been very, very important to the prosecution of the war, whether we're talking about Germany or the European Union, many different countries of Europe. I think that's clear. And I think on the Ukrainian side, in terms of war objectives, obviously survival is the first objective, but probably a close second after survival is joining Europe, whatever that might mean, whether it's joining NATO, joining the EU, finding a sort of anchored, firm place in institutional Europe. That's clearly one of the main Ukrainian war objectives, and that puts Europe front and center in this story. And clearly, when you look at the Kremlin's understanding of the war, to the degree that we can piece it together from abroad, it's really a war about Ukraine's place in Europe, and it's a war about Russia's place in Europe. And the war will certainly determine both of those questions. So I don't think that you could limit any analysis of this war to matters of territory. In Ukraine, it's objectively a larger war than that. The third axis, we'll bring it home for a moment, is the United States and Russia. I don't know if this was the pivotal axis in 2014, 2015, when everything was getting started. I think there maybe Europe, Ukraine, Russia is the necessary triangle. But certainly by the time you get to 2021, 2022, the U.S. is a major actor. And so I'll just make a point about this on the U.S. side and then a point about this on the Russian side, and then draw my comments to a close. You might ask, and I think some Americans do, why the United States cares as much as it does about Ukraine. We have upwards of $100 billion of military support and all kinds of thresholds that the United States has gone past in this war that it didn't go past in the Cold War. So there's a very high degree of commitment on the part of Washington to Ukraine. And the answer to that question, which may be revised or changed in November, depending on how the election goes, but until then, the answer to this question is that in the eyes of the White House, what's happening in Ukraine is going to be precedent-setting, both in its European dimensions. It is going to determine the contours and outlines of what Europe is, whether borders are negotiable or not, whether larger countries can invade smaller ones or not. That's what's at issue here. But I think the stakes are even higher than that for the U.S. This is a war that's going to determine international order. And so to the degree that you can make connections between the war in Ukraine and U.S. tension with Iran, to the degree that you can make connections between the war in Ukraine and U.S. tension with North Korea, to the degree that you can make a connection between the war in Ukraine and U.S. tension with China, especially over Taiwan, we see that for the U.S., this is a war that has a very prominent global profile, and that's why it's so significant, and that helps in part to explain the high level of U.S. support, in addition to concern for the humanitarian situation in Ukraine and to many factors that are there on the territory of Ukraine itself. On the Russian side, and here I'm not fully secure in my paraphrase, this may be the take on things, or it may be a official take on things, and behind closed doors the take may be somewhat different, but you get the impression that there are two unreal entities in this war for Russia. The first is Ukraine, not properly a nation, not properly a state, not really a country, something of a shell. And also Europe is presented as something of a shell as well. Not unreal, but not really a geopolitical actor, doesn't have a military, doesn't command the kind of leverage that Russia respects. And so behind these two shells is the United States. That's at least where a lot of official rhetoric inclines toward that narrative of the war. If that's true, if that's accurate, even incompletely accurate, it also suggests why the U.S. is so important to the conflict. And so that axis, of course, brings us back to the Cold War, and brings in the nuclear dimension, and it globalizes the war almost by definition. If this is really a kind of U.S.-Russia conflict, among other things, that makes it transatlantic and global in nature as well. My concluding point is this. If I can persuade you that this is three wars in one, or three conflicts in one, what I would like to argue is that each of these conflicts is unique unto itself. They're not identical. They run parallel, but they're not identical. Each has a different point of departure for different reasons. There are different geographies, different cultural histories, different political histories, different politics to these conflicts. They've played out in very different ways. The war is certainly one thing if you're in Ukraine. It's another thing if you're a frontline state, let's say Poland or Lithuania. It's another thing if you're Portugal. It's another thing if you live in California. And it's another thing if you live in Belgorod or if you live in Moscow or Petersburg. So all those differences matter. The nature of the war is different. But here's, I think, the more important point. It's going to conclude in ways that are going to be different along these three separate axes. They're not all going to conclude these conflicts on the same date, and they're not all going to conclude in the same way. So it's not as if anybody is suggesting that this war is simple, but I would like to underscore the complexity of the war with this tripartite framing of it. And although I'm not going to touch now on questions of policy, I think it matters a lot for policy to understand the nature of the conflict itself. So I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much, Michael. You really have a sweeping discussion of the last 30 years since the end of the Cold War. And I'm just going to go through a couple questions, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. But from your perspective, after the end of the Cold War, what was the biggest lost opportunity in order to try to have a different relationship with Russia?
Let me offer two answers to the question that are going to go in very contradictory directions because it's such a difficult question. Maybe the only way you can really answer it is with a contradiction and not with a especially clear answer. I don't think that all of the NATO debates are particularly pertinent here because I don't think, and this is of course highly debatable, that NATO or NATO expansion is the cause of the 2014 or of the 2022 war. So I'll take that off the table. Other people would look at it, I know, very differently, but I'll sort of leave that aside. So I don't think that there was a huge missed opportunity to do a different kind of NATO expansion or not do NATO expansion at all, and therefore not have tension with Russia. I think the missed opportunity goes back further in time, and it's not really about military affairs. I think it's about the decade of the 1990s, which is something that has been polemically characterized by a recent Navalny team video about that decade and what it signifies for Russian politics. But going outside of Russian politics for a moment, I think that the U.S. was too ungenerous. I think something like a Marshall Plan would have been prudent. If you look at the military spending of the last 2.5 years, I mentioned the sum of $100 billion. You can imagine that money otherwise spent. I know it's a bit of a fantasy to do that, but you could sort of imagine that. And perhaps that would have been money very well spent back in that decade for purposes of reconstruction, creation of goodwill, helping to rescue people from the difficulty of that transition. In a different sense, I think the kinds of ideas that the U.S. exported to Russia at the time and that Russia received in its own way were toxic. The kind of extreme neoliberal ideas that the U.S. exported. It didn't itself. The United States has never practiced those ideas fully, and I don't think that was a great gift to Russia. Would I blame the 2014 or 2022 wars on those ideas? No, I don't think it's that causal, but was it a missed opportunity? Very much so, I would say. So I think that we could have built a better foundation in the 1990s, meaning the United States. But the contradiction is this, in terms of what could have been done differently. I don't really understand now, and I think future historians will have difficulty explaining, why the West was so reluctant to arm Ukraine in 2014. There was this shyness, there was this worry, well, things are going to go off a cliff or they're going to get worse. They're going to unravel if we arm Ukraine. We need to have the pose of neutrality, although neutrality is not really what we pursued with Ukraine. We sort of wanted Ukraine to have a European path, and yet we never thought through carefully, seriously, comprehensively the question of Ukrainian security. So that was a huge failing. And maybe if you put these 2 points together, that a somewhat more generous set of postures toward Russia in the 1990s, and just more clarity about the need for Ukraine's security unto itself, not as a Russia problem, but as a matter that relates to Ukraine, that perhaps that could have put us on a different path and either postponed this conflict or made the conflict more difficult for Russia to initiate in the first place.
Yes, I agree. The Budapest Memorandum really did not stand up
No.
at all. In talking about Russia's future, you talked about whether Russia is going to be a European power going forward. And I always like to list all the institutions that Russia has been kicked out of, right, including the Council of Europe, the European Court of Human Rights, et cetera, et cetera. Is this a turning point for Russia and its relationship to Europe? I mean, they've basically said that they don't want to trade with Europe. They're not exporting all the raw materials that they used to. What really will be Russia's relationship with Europe after the end of this war?
I mean, I think the break is astonishing in scope. Intellectually, you like to look for nuance and try to think of where the nuance might come here, and perhaps there is some degree of nuance. You can look at gradations in European states, that Slovakia and Hungary are not the same in their attitude toward Russia as other European states, and you can try to focus in on that, but that's a footnote. The rupture is really astonishing in breadth and scope, and it includes all the things that you mentioned. Obviously, the military conflict is the key part of that rupture, but it's all the other broken relationships, whether we're speaking of the expert communities of different kinds, whether we're speaking of trade and commerce, whether we're speaking of diplomacy. There's a lot less diplomacy now than there was in most phases of the Cold War. The difficulty now of just traveling back and forth, sort of people-to-people isolation, is also probably as profound as it was in 1950 or some of the darkest days of the Cold War. But in a sense, even to describe all those aspects of the rupture doesn't do justice to the extent of the topic. I think that what Putin has done, probably consciously, is certainly to make his government, but also to make Russian society in many ways complicit with the war. It's not an incidental war to Russia. He's used the war to define Russia's place in the world. And so the task of a post-Putin leader who would wish to rejoin Europe is just astonishingly huge, that task. It would be unwinding the war itself, which is not easy. Surely it would be reparations to Ukraine, war crimes tribunals, all of the things that would modify or erase the issue of complicity. And who's going to do that? What kind of leader is going to have the courage or the ability to do that? Maybe it's possible. Many things are possible. And I don't think that this kind of isolation between Russia and Europe is natural. So there are forces that probably will push these two entities back together at some point. But the political dilemma is really extreme in ways that are just stark and lacking in nuance.
Putin fancies himself as an excellent historian. How do you rate Putin as an historian?
Well, I mean, academically speaking, the story is not good.
Yes.
The lack of interest in history apart from its ideological drivers is missing. The obsession with history is itself a very interesting aspect of what would you describe as middle Putinism, late Putinism. I think not that unusual for people who enjoy the kind of power that Putin enjoys to kind of see these historical visions and to place yourself in a grand historical context. I don't think it's especially unusual. I mean, a lot of kings and dictators and others have had these kinds of historical fantasies. So it's important to understand history as a driver of Putin's sensibility, but where, of course, this is especially worrisome, not just in some of the ways in which this can play into a kind of repressiveness within Russia, but where it's especially worrisome is in Putin's reading of Ukraine and an unwillingness to see Ukrainian history as in any sense separate from Russian history, and I think, as we all know, a kind of indulgence of the imperial side of Russian history at the expense of Ukrainianness. Now, you could say that this is an unpleasant set of ideas in and of itself, and that's true, but it's also an unpleasant set of ideas upon which the government is acting. So these historical fanaticisms or fantasies that Putin has are something that are playing out on the ground, and that's quite terrifying.
Even in the midst of this war, and of course the invasion of various parts of Ukraine, Putin still believes, I think in his heart, that Ukraine will be a part of Russia going forward. How delusional is that in terms of this war and the aftermath of this war?
Well, I mean, the delusions will be bolstered or eviscerated on the battlefield. So that's a question really about the course of the war itself. We can look at all the ways in which Putin has failed with this war. I think that these are self-evident. He failed to take Kiev. He failed to understand the Ukrainian population. He failed to anticipate the kind of resistance that he would get. Clearly, there was a huge amount of hubris on the eve of the war, and that comes from an overestimation of Russian power and an underestimation of Ukraine. That's probably not different today than it was 2.5 years ago, and we could, I think, tick through many more aspects of Putin's vision of Ukraine that's just not going to work, that's infeasible and that's impossible. But before we kind of dismiss that point, we do have to acknowledge that since 2014, Russia has hung on to Crimea. It certainly has Russified Crimea. Since 2014, Russia has held on to a sizable portion of eastern Ukraine, and the momentum of the war is currently on the Russian side, so it is possible for Russia, I think, to hold Ukrainian territory for a very long time to come. Whether it's possible to Russify that territory, I really don't know. That's one of the mysteries of the war to me, how things are going on the ground, probably with a lot of violence and coercion. Russification is to a degree possible. I guess we could look at the sort of history of city of Mariupol over the last 12 months and sort of speculate about what that signifies for the future. But of course, it's only going to be a portion of the country, and much less than Putin would wish to dominate. So it's a story of dominance, and dominance as a possibility, but much more limited than was hoped for. So I don't know. Delusional, not delusional. Sort of semi-delusional, certainly, but alas, not fully delusional.
You talked about the 90s and all the consultants that kind of went to Russia with various types of programs and so forth. But I think the most important thing that we thought that Russia was embracing, and now clearly is not, is this issue of globalization. Was Russia ever really able to deal with globalization, or did it always want to try to have its own version of globalization that really wasn't compatible with other notions of it?
Right. Well, I try to wrestle with this question. For historians, there's one very difficult matter when it comes to Russia over the last 30 years, and that's the 4 years of Medvedev's presidency. So you can say the man was a puppet, he was a non-entity, he was always controlled by Putin, and it's really just the last 20 years, 24 years are the history of Putin's reign. But I'm not sure that that's really true, and it seems a lot is kind of open-ended under Medvedev. So I'll give you two different answers to your question, one that stems from the Medvedev question and one that's a bit more oriented toward Putin. It is remarkable when you go back and look at the historical record how much of a fan of globalization Medvedev was or purported to be or claimed to be. The nickname iPhone-chick, little iPhone, that he acquired, his kind of enthusiasm for Western technology, his trips to Silicon Valley, his wish to create a Silicon Valley outside of Moscow. And I think the reason that this is not maybe as surreal as it might sound now is that if you went to Russia at the time, there were lots of ways in which Russian society was signing on to that vision of the world, of sort of more contact with Europe, more contact with the United States, more kinds of technology being incorporated from abroad that were signifiers of globalization. So that was all real for a time, or on the surface it was real, and I wouldn't want to fully dismiss that narrative. That was there. It sort of functioned as much as it did, and of course when Putin comes back to power in 2012, he's beginning to put an end to that phase of Russian life, but it's an intriguing open-ended phase for the time that it lasted. So there was that curiosity about accepting globalization in the terms that Medvedev did. But the second answer to the question is that Putin is perfectly comfortable with globalization. It's just that he has rejected emphatically what he would describe as American-led globalization. And a bitter revelation of the war has been, over the last 2.5 years, is that Russia is in fact a very globalized country. It has a connection to China that's integral to the Russian economy. Russia is conducting diplomacy all across the world. South Africa, Brazil, India, Vietnam, Turkey, etc. I was reading this morning about Turkey thinking of joining the BRICS as a vote of support for its relationship to Russia. So there's a whole web and network of relationships that Russia has, which is bringing wealth and technology into the country in wartime. All of that is globalization. And even, this is sort of the coup de grace for Russia at the moment, Russia is sort of winning the global war of public opinion when it comes to the war in Ukraine. The United States is certainly not winning that battle as far as one can judge. And since October 7th, I think there's been a marked advance in the kind of Russian narratives about, if not the war in Ukraine, then about the state of affairs more generally. So Russia's not globalized, certainly in the way that we expected it to become globalized in the 1990s. Globalization now means new things, different things. It's far more fragmented than it was. But I think Putin has, to a degree, succeeded in creating a kind of Russian globalization or a globalization in which Russia can participate. It's just that globalization is wedded to war and is wedded to the break with the West that we were speaking about earlier. So it comes as a shock.
No, I was interested that in terms of globalization, you mentioned South Africa and Brazil, two countries that Putin can't go to. And that is kind of his reality as well. Sure. So the last question I have, and then we'll open up for questions from the audience, is you talked about guardrails and the need for guardrails going forward.
Yeah.
What do you think can be the new guardrails? And where will be the source of cooperation to actually create these new guardrails?
So I don't think that negotiation stands any kind of a chance for the foreseeable future. I don't think that Putin has moderated his war aims as they were on the 24th of February 2022. And those war aims encompass really the destruction of the Ukrainian polity in some form or fashion. And I don't think that that's a result that the U.S. can agree to. And I think to the extent that I can read the tea leaves in Ukraine, I don't think that there's any appetite in Ukraine for negotiations along the lines of territorial concessions or things that might produce an armistice or a ceasefire or a formal end to the conflict. So, that's a testable hypothesis, but that's the hypothesis I work with, that we're not going to negotiate ourselves out of this war. So I think that leaves two options for the U.S. in terms of how to go forward, and one is not really about diplomacy. The first is not, but the second is, so I can conclude on that note. But I think that the U.S. needs to sustain its support for Ukraine in a very robust way, and to the extent possible, with all the transitions that are built into democratic American life, to indicate that the support is going to be there for the long term, and to continue the alliance building and networks of support that the U.S. has been really so good at constructing over the last 2.5 years, for the sake of Ukraine's security, for the sake of its political survival, for the sake of just the overall functioning of Ukrainian society. So that's a core task that the United States has that is, again, non-negotiable. Where diplomacy, I think, has a role, and I don't think that this is going to function now, a year from now or 2 years from now, but it may come a bit over that horizon, is that the U.S. can look for rules of engagement with Russia. Not an end to the conflict, not a negotiated settlement, but rules of engagement, which, if you think back to the Cold War, happens 10, 15 years into the Cold War. It's not as if the Soviet Union and the U.S. are able to eliminate the tension between them, but they can find ways of not, letting the worst-case scenarios come to pass. So if that's doable, if that's possible through negotiation, and I think a bit of that happens going through the office of Director of the CIA, Bill Burns, who I think does have a degree of contact in Moscow, and there must be some discussion of red lines and worst-case scenarios. If that's doable diplomatically, then that should certainly be done, because it's a dangerous world, and these are two nuclear powers. But that's as optimistic as I can be, that rules of engagement may be possible, but a resolution to the conflict is going to be a very long time coming, and it's going to be found not at the negotiating table so much as on the battlefield itself.
Thanks so much. A reminder to our virtual audience, if you want to ask a question, you can do so over Facebook at Kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter at Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page. So we're going to open it up for questions from the audience, and I see a lot of hands, and we'll just start right here. And we're going to get a microphone to you. Yes.
Thank you. Very interesting discussion. My name is Martin Herman. I follow the situation in Eastern Europe, in Ukraine. I've been there. I'm originally from Czechoslovakia. I experienced the 1968 Russian invasion there. And my question is, I think, and that is a fundamental question, the Russian government, a federation government, the Russian opposition, and many decision makers outside Russia are fearing the spectacle of Russia falling apart. You've been referring throughout the debate here about Russia, Russia, Russia. Russia is a federation of many units, many states, some of which are the richest in natural resources, but the poorest, like Yakutia, for example. Why is the US, and that is for Donald Trump, Biden, or whoever, so afraid of Russia falling apart and not doing anything to help that process? There are people there already that are fed up in these localities. Thank you very much.
Sure.
Okay.
Oh, I see that.
Michael.
Thank you, sir.
Well, two answers, and it's hard to have a crystal ball in terms of what can happen in the future. But the dissolution of the Russian state seems to me very improbable. I don't think that there's that much pressure on the ground for the sake of it. People benefit too much from having the kinds of things that a state provides. And after all, in Russia, huge numbers of people work for the state or profit from it, receive money from it. And so the incentives to see the state dissolve, I think, are small, certainly dramatically smaller than in the late Soviet period, where you had all these proto-nations that were waiting to break free from the Soviet Union. That, I think, is a profoundly different situation from the present moment. And this is a state that, as long as Putin is able to survive biologically and stay at the core of it, I mean, it has huge amounts of power at its disposal. So, I don't see too many challenges in a way that could arise from the regions that the state couldn't deal with. It's not 1917 in terms of the war and the kind of disarray that you had there, or 1991 where you had disarray for a different set of reasons. So that, I think, is just an improbable outcome. But I wait to be proved wrong about that kind of prediction. But that's a prediction I would make. As for U.S. policy, I mean, there's no way, I think, in which the U.S. can have a policy of regime change toward a nuclear power. It's just that, to me, seems almost axiomatic. You don't do it. It's not your business to go that far. It's not your business to suggest that you would be willing to endanger the survival of a state or of a regime when that regime has nuclear weapons at its disposal. That would be one reason. But the other would be the record of regime change when it comes to U.S. foreign policy is just abysmal. It's never worked out as the U.S. expected. And there have been so many catastrophes in the last 20, 30 years that you could put under the heading of regime change that my inclination would be just to stay away from that altogether, but absolutely to stay away from anything that suggests regime change when you have the nuclear situation as it is. So that, to me, seems where Washington should be. What the situation on the ground is, sort of time will tell. But somehow, I don't think that that's our exit from the current crisis.
Wayne.
Thank you. Wayne Murray, American Foreign Policy Council. I've not read your book yet. I will. But you have laid out three axes of how this whole question has developed. Let me ask you to comment on a fourth, the axis of American domestic politics, because we are now in the third American presidential election in a row in which the subject of Ukraine is prominent. In 2016, this organization, the Kennan Institute, commissioned me to go to the two political party conventions to report on how Russia was playing out there. And what I found in both of them is that it was much more Ukraine. And issues were prominent then that are prominent today. For example, Hunter Biden in Ukraine. For example, the whole question of how the United States plays a role in the internal politics of Ukraine. So if I were looking ahead to look back, I would think one of the more interesting historical things would be how American political historians will interpret Ukraine as having been an American domestic issue in the early part of this century, at a time when most Americans barely know where the damn place is. I wonder if you could comment on that American domestic metric in this.
Sure. So, sort of two responses to that. One that's going to be a little bit boring in a way, and the other I'll try to meet the color of your question straight on, because it is a colorful question. It's a colorful topic in American life, putting it mildly. The first is that there's a lot of continuity in U.S.-Ukraine policy, for better or worse, from the 1990s all the way down to 2022. The hardest thing to do, or one of the hardest things to do I found in the writing of this book, was to deal with the Trump presidency, in part because it's close in time and we all tend to have strong opinions about those years. But it's also just very difficult to pin down what was important foreign policy-wise and what wasn't. But I come to the conclusion in that chapter, I think I'm quoting verbatim from the book, when I say that Trump was a moderately conservative or moderately traditional Republican president when it came to both Russia and Ukraine. No concessions. He maintained sanctions, lethal military assistance to Ukraine, and 2 new countries enter NATO under Trump's watch. So that's, pretty consistent with George W. Bush's foreign policy toward the region, and not inconsistent with Barack Obama's policy and with Joe Biden's policy toward the region more broadly. So in some ways, what's interesting about domestic American politics is how consistent it is on the subject of Ukraine and Russia. And that's not the interesting story, but I think it's in many ways the true story of the last 20 years. But if you turn more inward, what you get is something vastly more interesting, and this is just the surreal role that Ukraine has played for reasons that are in some ways quite accidental. Paul Manafort becoming the campaign chairman in 2016, that links Ukraine and the U.S. in one way. The bizarre career, just waiting for cinematic adaptation, of Konstantin Kilimnik, this mystery man who, sort of comes in 2016 and then becomes a subject of intrigue in terms of all the various theories of what Russia's role was in the 2016 election. Certainly Trump's first impeachment is all about Ukraine, the most perfect phone call, and, the kind of Trump-Zelensky relationship, all of that is simply rather surreal. And why Ukraine is at the center of it, I really wouldn't begin to know why Ukraine and not another country. I suspect it's just the accident in some ways of Paul Manafort's appointment, and that links the Trump campaign in some ways to Ukraine. Hunter Biden, of course, you mentioned as well. I'm not sure that that's such a huge story in American life, or at least not quite yet. But also rather surreal in some ways that it would be what it would be. But I would emphasize, whatever we can say about the kind of crazy nature of Ukraine's symbolic and perhaps real place in American domestic politics, I don't think that the effect on foreign policy has been all that substantial. So they seem to be almost 2 parallel tracks, the domestic one and the foreign policy track, and they don't seem to interconnect all that much.
For our virtual audience, if you want to ask a question, you can send it via email at kennan@wilsoncenter.org, via Twitter at Kennan Institute, or on our Facebook page. We're going to open it up for more questions. Let's take 2 questions. We take Bill and this gentleman in the back.
Thanks. Bill Hill, also on the Kennan Advisory Council. And congratulations both on your boldness for writing a history while the history is still going on, but also for capturing, I think, the complexity and the various layers or multiple aspects, significant aspects of the war in Ukraine. That it goes, I think you're very right, that it goes far beyond just the collision between Moscow and Kyiv to things that are far beyond and important and affect a far greater part of the Earth's population. But starting it, I want to ask in particular about starting in 2008. I realize you've got to start somewhere, and somebody can always, come then, Monday morning quarterbacking saying, but I'm just wondering, what you would say or how you look at other aspects that I think might also be important before 2008, Putin's personal involvement. Coming out of Russian efforts to keep Ukraine integrated through the CIS in the 90s, but then Putin through a projected customs union and actually actively campaigning in Ukraine for Yanukovych in 2004, losing out, having the West foiling him there. To what extent this might offer some personal explanation along with the geopolitical and raison d'etat in this, but then more broadly, can one also, in addition, look at the conflict as part of a post-imperium syndrome where Russia, the Yeltsin administration, had rocky relations with Ukraine until they finally reached an agreement on the Black Sea Fleet in 1997. Relations were up and down throughout. Between there was an autonomy agreement for Crimea, but questions of territorial settlement were not necessarily nailed down and then ultimately relayed by the Russians later. So to what extent does this also enter into and explain part of the emergence and severity of the conflict?
And we're going to have the second question back here.
Thank you. Glenn Goddard, I guess full disclosure, Brigadier General, U.S. Army, retired. So people often ask me, what's your military assessment of Ukraine? And to me, the Korean War is most similar, where both sides have gone back and forth, but they've settled along a line that is hard to change because of all of the fortifications that have been put in, mining, et cetera. And it becomes a grind, right? This is where, although we've put a lot of emphasis on providing the weapon systems to the Ukrainians and what do the Russians get in return, the Ukrainians have a distinct disadvantage in personnel. 6,000 casualties a month is just not sustainable for them, and they've already had the controversy of lowering the draft age down to 25. So that can only continue if Ukraine needs to keep up the number of units they have to defend their country. So the political pressures on Zelensky then, how do you see him comporting that of, I don't want to make a compromise, I don't want an armistice, but yet in the long term, I've got to do something?
Well, thank you so much for both questions. Just to summarize for myself, so why begin in 2008 and the nature of the challenge facing President Zelensky? So indeed, one could begin with the Orange Revolution. That would be a good point of departure, to be sure. All I knew is that I didn't want to begin with the Munich Security Conference speech of 2007, because the problem with that, although it's a very reasonable point of departure, is that then you're going to have a linear narrative. You're going to go from the blueprint in 2007 to the war in 2014 or 2022, and that's not what I wanted to do. In some ways, I wanted to almost do the opposite in terms of the argument or really the narrative that I was developing. And so 2008 to me with Obama and Medvedev is the moment of non-inevitability. I don't think that either leader of either country was consumed with the idea or even able to contemplate the idea of war in Ukraine in those years. Now, granted, maybe Putin was behind the scenes plotting it all out, and again, Medvedev is merely the puppet, in which case that's a bit of a conceit, but so be it. I mean, that was the tenor of the moment, and I think it was really a period of non-inevitability. I don't see anything as particularly inevitable until Yanukovych flees. And so for me, I want to bring forward the contingency of that, the accidental nature of it. And it strikes me as a historian that that's exactly 100 years after the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand, which I think is somewhat similar, just kind of an accidental event that sets a lot of things in motion that in a way no side is really able to fully control. I think by the time you get to 2020 or 2021, you're closer to inevitability and to the planning of the 2022 invasion, and then you can tell a story of blueprint to action much more directly. But that's why 2008 for me. And I want my reader to also begin in the sense that this is not an inevitable event. And so the reader then is forced to ask the question, how did it become, if not inevitable, how did it become possible? And that's what the book tries to address. And so 2008 is useful for those purposes. But to go to the second part of your question, to be sure, many historical questions come into play that go back well before the Orange Revolution. Certainly, notions of geography and empire. I think the bequest of the Soviet Union. I haven't read the whole book yet, but Sergei Rodchenko has a very nice new book on the history of the Cold War, and he's clearly, you can see between the lines, trying to explain the war in Ukraine through the history of the Cold War, and it has to do with certain mindsets and attitudes on the part of Soviet leadership. So you could take that and put that into the background as well, which is I think quite illuminating and worthwhile. So there'll be, hopefully, when it comes to this event, there'll be deep histories and there'll be more proximate and immediate histories, and they should be in dialogue with each other. But mine is certainly more on the immediate and proximate side. So, of course, the challenges that President Zelensky faces are immense, and I think you're right to pinpoint politics as among those challenges. Although he's a skilled leader, he's a great communicator, and I think he has still the support of the vast majority of his population. He doesn't have real political problems, but you can see how reluctant he's been to mobilize over the last 12 months when the military rationale for that is quite good, and I think Washington is pushing Ukraine to go in that direction. So there's the trade-off that he's struggling with between the country's future, which is going to depend on its young people, and staying in the war or winning the war, which is going to depend on getting those young people into uniform, and that's simply a trade-off. And I would add to the difficulties that you mentioned, because you mentioned Korea and how a line of contact was developed there. Korea, after all, is a peninsula, and it's I think easier to defend a line of contact. Ukraine is a huge country, and you have a threat from the north, from Belarus. You have a threat from Crimea in the south, and you have a threat from the east, from Russia proper. So that's a huge, I can't remember, is it 1,200 miles? I mean, enormous border that Ukraine has to defend. So that only compounds the manpower problem. But there are ways in which Ukraine has compensated for that, and it does have lots of powerful friends with very sophisticated weaponry. And I think the way in which Ukraine has made Crimea now a net negative for Russia, that it's really not a great military base, it's not a great place to go on vacation, it's not a great place to be. And it was perhaps all of those things before the 2022 invasion. You could say that Putin had kind of achieved that, quote unquote, for Russia, and now that's been lost. And so I think that becomes, in microcosm, the Ukrainian way forward in the war, is to make even the territory that Russia has a part of the story of the larger futility of this war for Russia. And how that registers, I don't think it registers in the dissolution of Russia, that sense of futility, but perhaps in a desire to change gears or pull back from the war. That, I think, is the recipe for success over the long term. But it's maybe not exactly how much territory you have or exactly where the border is, but along the lines of making the territory that Russia holds not very attractive to hold.
Questions? Right here in the back.
My Ormsby, Active Resources. Sorry about my voice. One of the powerful motivations for Putin to go into war, it was to establish control of the warm waters in the Black Sea. So the Russian fleet, the dreams of the Russian fleet that are, centuries old. And to a very large degree, this is all lost. The fleet, the military presence in the Black Sea, the control of the Black Sea. So that it must be a major kind of demotivating factor or disappointment factor. How do you see this to kind of progress in the terms of the war when it's very clear that one of the main objectives was not only not achieved, but rather kind of has a complete negative result?
Thank you for the question. I mean, I think in a way I would just give a version of the answer I just gave a moment ago to the question about manpower, territory, and the Korea analogy, that in a sense it's an extension of what's happened in Crimea, and one of the big surprises of the last year, which is the long string of successes Ukraine has had in its naval operations. And Ukraine doesn't have that much of a navy, but it does have the capacity to really degrade the Russian Navy in the Black Sea, and that's just been a huge development over the last year. But again, I would offer the same kind of answer. It's not going to end the war. That's not enough to end the war. But it does contribute to the sense of futility, that the war is a losing proposition for Russia. I do believe, I'm trying to abstract myself as much from moral judgment here as much as I can as an outside observer, but I do believe that for Russia this is a senseless war. It's not a war that's going to contribute to Russia's wealth, its power, its position in the world, its health as a society. It's senseless for Russia. Obviously, that's not Putin's logic, or else he wouldn't have invaded, or else he wouldn't continue the war. But to drive home the truth of that is maybe as important a wartime objective for Ukraine as anything it does in the immediate sense on the battlefield. So wars are wars of narratives. We have the narrative of Ukrainian heroism that's been there since the beginning. I don't think that's enough, but this narrative of the futility of the war as such for Russia is crucial, and perhaps it's the job of our politicians to make sure that that narrative is conveyed and transmitted as effectively as possible. In that regard, I don't see that much creativity in Washington or other political capitals, but that might be something to consider.
We have some online questions, and one of them, I'm going to get to it. Could you please elaborate a little bit more on the German example, German scholars in World War II and Russian scholars now?
I wish I could ask our online questioner to elaborate a little bit on the question, the German example of German scholars and Russian scholars vis-a-vis the Second World War. Well, I'm not quite sure what's meant by the question, but I do have the sense, maybe just offer this as a general thought, that all of us at the moment, this goes to the various axes of the conflict, are divided by our memories of the Second World War. And I know that there's a debate about D-Day and whether there should be a Russian presence there. And then, of course, you have May 9th as a very conspicuous celebration of the end of the Second World War in Russia, and all of the ways in which Second World War memory have been instrumentalized. So just make this very simple point in response to the question. What's astonishing to me as a historian is how much we still live somehow in the memories of the Second World War. That's just a very, very striking point to me. And the lessons that Germany drew from the Second World War, sort of never again, pacifism and peace. And obviously Putin has drawn a different set of lessons about self-defense and honoring the memory of one's ancestors, and the need to be vigilant and such. And you just see how Second World War memory creates worlds of political and perceptual difference.
I'll try to elaborate on that question as well. Obviously, the end of World War II ended with the Nuremberg trials, an attempt to hold Germany responsible. To what extent would this war end in some sort of international tribunal that tries to hold Russia accountable?
It's a little bit hard to imagine at the moment, but probably Nuremberg was very difficult to imagine in 1941 or 1942 as well. I think Russia's unconditional surrender sounds very hard for me to imagine. So what you would need for widespread criminal, sort of war crimes tribunals and such would be a major change in the political tenor of Russia itself. And if that's conceivable, then I think war crimes trials are conceivable as well. Certainly, there are people who are doing extraordinary amounts of work, and I think some of this intersects with the work of the Kennan Institute in documenting war crimes and making the information available for the time when the motors of justice may be, sort of up and running in this regard. But it's work that has to be done for the future.
Any other questions?
Thank you. My name is Dominic Peter, and I'm from the George Mason's University. I wanted to ask, how does it help Ukraine's war efforts to engage Russian operations out of Ukraine, such as in Syria and Sudan?
Well, I don't think that there's too much of a connection. I mean, Russia has a kind of fairly minimal presence in Syria, although it plays a role in the diplomacy of the region and gives Russia political leverage in Syria, and North Africa seems to me even more distant. And I can't imagine, even if one were to eliminate Russia's military presence in North Africa, that it would really have much of an effect on the war in Ukraine, or if one were to eliminate Russia's military presence from Syria, I don't think it would have too much of an effect on the war in Ukraine. In some ways, if you think of Russia's outside connections, sort of connections to outside regions, it's not so much the military presence that Russia has that enables it to fight its war in Ukraine. It's the kind of relationships that Russia has, especially with Iran and North Korea. But there's a whole range of other countries that are now smuggling goods into Russia. I think it's clear, and the State Department has indicated this over the last week, that China is assisting the Russian war effort. So it's these relationships that are enabling the Russian military to continue producing and to continue waging this war. And I think that's where effort needs to be. Directed. If you could disrupt those flows and those sort of relationships, if you could at least make it more difficult, make it more expensive, make it more precarious, then I think that you can have an effect on the war in Ukraine. But the kind of expeditionary activities of Russia are, by comparison with the United States, very, very small, and are not the kind of fulcrum on which the war is turning.
We have one last question by email, and that's from Stanislav Stansky. And he talks about the ability of U.S. academia to take advantage of the many Russian scholars who are now in the United States and so forth. So to what extent is this a potential group that can help explain this war? And are we taking advantage of this expertise going forward?
Okay, I'm a little bit skeptical about the verb "to take advantage."
Well,
it's a little bit to me like enlisting or sort of putting into service. So I might choose a slightly different.
Please do.
A slightly different verb. I guess the prerogative of sitting in this seat. I think that there are multiple responsibilities when it comes to this subject. There's the responsibility to help and assist, which is sort of a moral responsibility, and of course that applies equally to other scholars who are in distress for political or for other reasons. Of course, there's a lot of insight that's going to be gained from this. There are lots of brilliant people who are operating, and it's simply a sort of a privilege, a luxury almost, to have these people in our midst. Again, not taking advantage, but sort of appreciating what's there. But I would commend to everybody, since we do, speak in a sense for the Kennan Institute and for the work of scholarship and study writ large, a wonderful book written, I think, in the 1970s by a historian by the name of Mark Ryeff, and the title of the book is Russia Abroad. And Mark Ryeff was himself the product of a different Russian wave of emigration that was around the time of the Russian Revolution, and his parents, I think, went to the Baltic republics and then to France, and then he became a professor at Columbia. But he documented this extraordinarily rich world in many different countries, the United States, other places, where an entire culture was sustained and kept alive. And that's a remarkable book. It's a very beautiful book about also times of war and displacement and diaspora populations, but it's also a book, it's not really a sad book. In a way, it's a kind of luminous book about how much these people wrote and how much they accomplished and how vibrant the cultural life was. And there isn't a lot in diplomatic and military affairs that's truly win-win. And there's very, very little that's truly win-win. This situation, I think, is win-win, that there are just a lot of gains to be had for everybody involved, including people back in Russia.
Well, the book is Collisions, and it's outside if you want to purchase one. Are you able to sign it as well?
Of course, yes.
Okay. So I want to thank Michael for his excellent conversation and his book about all these different aspects of this war that is essential reading going forward. So thank you, Michael, and thank you for everyone who participated in this event. And we look forward to having you at future Kennan Institute events as well. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Will.